inside a packed, prestigious Harvard lecture hall. Professor Amelia Carter slammed her chalk down, smirking at a janitor mopping near the back, dismissing him instantly because of his uniform. She believed a man pushing a mop had no business solving an equation that stumped her elite department for years. The biased crowd laughed as she started, a 2-minute countdown on the screen. Then, the underestimated janitor set his mop aside, walked to the front and confidently picked up the chalk. No one realized their superficial assumptions were about to shatter the reputation of this titled genius before any cameras even started rolling. Before a global livestream broadcast his back into mathematics departments across 3 different countries. Elias Reed, the overlooked genius, was already waiting inside that fateful auditorium. He slipped through the side door at 5 a.m., carrying only keys and a trash cart, just as he had done every single weekday for nearly 10 years. The empty room was cold, dark, and smelling faintly of wood polish. The front chalkboard still displayed the complex equations from yesterday's elite lecture, half erased, ghosted in dust. He parked his cleaning cart by the stage and clicked on a single overhead light. His brilliant eyes scanned those chalk lines, reading them effortlessly, the way someone else might skim the morning news, wincing slightly whenever a flawed mathematical step caught his highly analytical eye. A celebrated, tenured professor had written them, supposedly an expert. Yet the third step contained a clear mistake. Elias had spotted it 3 weeks ago while simply wiping down the board. He chose not to speak up then, keeping his quiet genius to himself. He carefully cleaned around the math, preserving a world he was told he did not belong in. Upstairs in the graduate lounge, a whiteboard displayed unfinished problems from struggling students. He stopped to examine them, admiring the math like a beautiful window display. The work was poor, yet he passed no judgment and simply kept moving. This was hardly the first time he studied advanced equations left unlocked by careless academics. That was his only identity here. Just a man in gray coveralls wearing an ignored name tag. He emptied trash cans and mopped the grand marble floors outside the dean's luxurious suite. He refilled soap dispensers for professors who never looked at him. He politely nodded to the few professors arriving before dawn. Most merely dismissed him, barely looking up from their glowing phones. He knew every supply closet code and all the hidden back stairwells. He never learned the first names of the prestigious faculty members. And they certainly never asked for his. Only a kind teaching assistant named Hannah Pierce ever greeted him in the elevator while heading up to teach her introductory classes. That brief moment was his only real human connection in this place. During a bitter, snowy morning the previous February, she held the doors while he struggled with a heavy cart of broken chairs. He thanked her softly. She offered a warm smile and the doors quietly shut. She kept reflecting on that brief meeting, realizing how easily she had misjudged him. Hidden away in a dark basement behind a maintenance door. Sitting there was a cheap table he used for brilliant work. He studied discarded textbooks, proving real intellect doesn't need fancy resources. Cheap pads were covered in complex math, filled from margin to margin. Every notebook was marked by a hand the world ignored. He worked under a simple lamp he bought himself, entirely self-funded and proud. His broken chair on raw concrete was a far cry from tenured luxury. He solved equations on his cleaning breaks. When the campus emptied, the humble janitor sat beneath a single warm light, studying until 2 in the morning, tackling problems the elite professors couldn't crack. For over a year he quietly chased one legendary puzzle. He found it on a crumpled printout left behind in the teacher's lounge 14 months ago. Left like trash beside a half-eaten stale donut. Sandwiched between worthless memos about staff parking. This brutal theory problem had already defeated 3 famous academic teams over 9 long years. The highly paid experts only failed, producing nothing but contradictory results. Yet this blue-collar worker studied all their failures. He instinctively knew the famous scholars had made a critical mistake early on, but he had not yet proven where. He remained just one step away from exposing their elite errors. Hidden inside his cheap notebook was a picture from his past. A younger, hopeful version of this unrecognized genius, posing with doctoral candidates at a top-tier university. He rarely looked at it, knowing degrees do not define intelligence. He simply remembered when life fell apart, stripping him of his academic title. His mentor passed away, and overwhelming debts crushed his tiny student's stipend before he could finish. He endured exhausting commutes through a cold city. Poverty made him feel trapped, though his mind remained free. He quit the prestigious school before they could kick him out. He hid his brilliant past away, letting people judge him solely by his maintenance uniform. He chose a simple janitorial job where nobody expected anything from him. It paid the bills and offered quiet peace. Best of all, chalkboards were everywhere. Upstairs, the highly celebrated Amelia Carter sat in her luxurious office defined by her fancy title. Driven by prestige and ego, she prepared for her big moment. Her face was plastered on every wall, her elite status on full display. The entire university praised her work, blindly assuming her status meant perfection. She meticulously rehearsed her presentation, obsessing over her professional image. She checked the stage lights, caring far more about looking smart than actual mathematical truth. Her entire persona was highly calculated. She was brilliant at defending her reputation, a master of academic politics. At 36, she had amassed social status instead of real wisdom, constructing a perfect illusion, constantly judging others by their credentials and appearance. She published just 2 papers annually, judging others purely by credentials. She routinely rejected dinner invites from colleagues she deemed intellectually inferior. And she only accepted invitations from high-status elites whose influence she might later need. A colleague tried to warn her last week, as they both poured coffee in the lounge, that her supreme intellectual pride made for a lonely career. She looked at him with quiet arrogance, smiled, and replied that being ordinary was worse. 9 years back, during her very first year teaching on faculty, she published a paper outlining a problem she arrogantly claimed that no normal academic could ever solve within her lifetime. Over the years, the problem was restated and reframed several times. Now it carried the proud title given during her elite tenure party. The Carter conjecture, unsolved for 9 boastful years. 9 years of invisible trophies, worn not on her chest but in the haughty way she looked down on everyone around her. The presentation that morning was more about showing off her status than actual scholarship. And she never even hid it. She had personally requested the broadcast go live. She wanted her fame to spread. She wanted graduate students in Berlin, Cambridge, and Princeton to hear her famous name and feel a heavy, intimidating pressure behind it. She once told a colleague that the true goal of status was not simply to earn respect, but to become utterly unavoidable. Her peer did not laugh. Walking down the hallway toward the main auditorium at 9:15, she passed a working man in dusty coveralls, moving his cleaning cart aside to let her pass. She ignored him completely based on his uniform, as he stared at the floor. They had passed each other in that exact hallway perhaps 400 times, yet she never once acknowledged a simple worker like him. The hall filled rapidly with 3 cameras pointed directly at the stage. The online broadcast went live at 9:30. Amelia stepped up to the podium, basking in the polite, expectant applause, before letting the room settle. She began with her proud theory, writing it across the chalkboard in an elegant, practiced hand. The kind of elite script designed to show every doctor in the room that she was completely supreme. She lectured on the complex structure of her problem for about 6 minutes. The initial framing, the failed attempts, and the incomplete solutions other academics had published, then quietly withdrawn. The crowd watched in awe, listening like they were witnessing a flawless, perfect performer. Finally, she laid the chalk down and turned to face them. She wore the smug smile she reserved for when she was about to perform the self-serving part of her presentation that she enjoyed most. She announced that if anyone present could actually produce a complete and flawless, perfect solution to her elite challenge in just 2 minutes, they would get a sincere public apology from her right there on stage before all of Harvard. Mockingly, she added she would also write them a golden recommendation letter to any top university on earth. The crowd chuckled, while a few elites clapped. She scanned the front row looking for a simple student to patronizingly call on. Someone who looked meek and nervous enough to play along as nicely for the online audience. She had already run this elite routine at 4 conferences that year. Her eyes scanned past the front rows, completely overlooking the back of the room. until her gaze stopped right by the rear exit. There stood a man in cheap, dusty coveralls, dragging a damp mop across the floor, completely invisible to the scholars. He was just there to clean a spilled coffee, a low-status task that made him entirely easy to ignore. The smug look on her face shifted. She leaned in closer to the microphone. "I will take a challenge from anyone in this room," she said smoothly, "even the gentleman in the back with the mop and bucket." The entire crowd turned to look back. You and I know that hesitation, the quiet moment before we decide if a joke is cruel or funny. Then a student laughed, and the rest of the room joined in, mocking him. But Elias did not look up. He just kept pushing his mop in slow figure eights, his expression completely blank. Down front, Hannah Pierce shifted uncomfortably, looking back at the man the crowd was laughing at. She had seen this quiet custodian around the building, in the math hallways for her entire time in the graduate program. She had never once spoken to him properly, realizing now how easily we dismiss people who clean up after us. "I'm serious," Amelia called out into the microphone. "If anyone can solve this in just 2 minutes, I will stand on this stage at Harvard and publicly admit that I was wrong. And I'll write you a glowing letter of recommendation." That arrogant offer triggered the loudest laughs of the morning. A couple of students in front held up their phones to record. In the second row, a professor shook his head, amused by the mock challenge. Sitting near the back, the department chair, Daniel Whitman, did not join in on the joke. He knew better than to judge a person's worth by their uniform. And what he saw in the janitor's eyes did not match the crowd's mockery. Amelia turned back to the screen. She tapped the control panel on her wooden podium. The timer flashed to life. 2 minutes glowing white on a dark screen. She hit start, and the cameras did what they always do. One lens zoomed in on the janitor, treating his presence like a cheap punchline. You and I know that brilliant minds are often hidden behind the most ordinary faces. Elias had taken that exact problem home 14 months ago. He had solved more of it than any academic in the world. He had been stuck on just one final step for months. This math was not new to him. He had been working through it, line by line, for over a year. The timer ticked down to 1 minute 45. The smug crowd watched him stare at the board. Amelia smiled for the cameras, waiting for the easy victory to conclude. In their eyes, he was just a mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. But you and I should remember, a person's brilliance is never defined by their uniform or their job. But the chalk sat on the tray, the massive equation waited on the board, and he had lived with that math for 14 months. He leaned his mop gently against the wall, like a master pausing his craft for just a moment. He stepped over his dirty bucket cord and slowly walked up the side aisle. The first mocking laugh came straight from the middle of the room. But the mockery died before he even reached the third row. The entire auditorium fell silent, a heavy quiet unlike anything from a minute ago. Shocked eyes followed his every step. A student sitting near the aisle lowered his phone, then raised it back up. Hannah Pierce sat completely frozen near the front, watching this simple worker climb the stage stairs. He walked up those 3 steps. Amelia turned, finally seeing the genius she had ignored for 9 years in this building. Whatever she was preparing to say to, the rolling cameras died in her throat. The confident smile she wore did not vanish entirely, but it definitely lost its clean shape. He walked right past her without offering a single glance. He strode up to the podium and claimed the chalk. The piece of chalk was worn down on one side. He flipped it around without even needing to think. The entire room went dead silent. It was the silence of 300 people trying to figure out what they were watching. Behind him, the digital clock showed 1 minute and 20 seconds. The live cameras held steady. Inside a graduate dorm across the river, an old classmate watched the stream and slowly leaned forward, instantly recognizing a brilliant face he had not seen in decades. The viewer count on Amelia's official live stream silently tripled over the last 60 seconds. For nearly a decade, he chose to stay invisible inside this building. He had scrubbed the offices of professors who were once his academic peers. He had studied their blackboard equations, emptied their trash, and walked these prestigious halls as an invisible man. He could easily drop the chalk right now. After all, who expects brilliance from someone holding a mop and bucket? But the unsolvable math was right there, and the solution was waiting in his hand. But now, for the first time in 9 years, Elias Reed would let himself be seen. The timer showed 1 minute and 17 seconds when Elias started to read. He stood with his back turned to the crowd, staring directly at the chalkboard. The difficult conjecture was written in Amelia's neat handwriting. It was the script of absolute academic authority. His gaze slowly traced down the first line, then the second, then the third. Seeing his own life work written on a board by someone else felt completely surreal. Just like hearing a song you wrote being sung back to you by a stranger. Amelia slowly stepped out from behind her podium. Her professional smile remained plastered on, but its confident edges were beginning to crack. "Take your time," she announced directly into her microphone. Her tone was casual, almost mocking. "We still have 1 minute and 15 seconds. A few people in the crowd chuckled, but the laughter was much weaker than it was moments ago. Most eyes in the room dismissed him as just a janitor, ignoring the elite professor. Elias didn't even turn around. The blue-collar worker raised his hand, tapping the chalk twice against the complex equation, testing the structure, the way a master builder inspects a load-bearing wall. Behind him, the famous academic turned to the cameras, showing off with a small theatrical shrug for her audience. "He is reading it," she sneered, mocking his intellect like a teacher talking down to a slow student. The crowd laughed, judging him by his uniform, though the chuckling quickly faded. This quiet janitor had read every single attempt at the famous theory, even memorizing 2 of them. Like everyone else, he once assumed the prestigious minds before him were correct, believing that the famous professor's basic setup of the math problem was flawless. The small constraint she had put in her highly praised original paper, that almost decorative condition in her opening lines, had been blindly accepted as fact by everyone in the scientific community. 3 separate, elite research teams spent 9 years trapped inside her false limitation, getting conflicting results that no academic expert could ever make sense of. In his humble basement room, the janitor wondered why all 3 attempts had failed. Those published papers arrived at near answers pointing in 3 completely opposite directions. Highly funded, brilliant mathematicians on every single team. Yet all of them missed the mark. Because of her prestige, he never dared to question if the professor was wrong initially. Her limitation was not real math, it was just an arrogant assumption she had made. He had stared at her mistake for 14 months, blinded by her academic reputation. And every top expert had done the exact same. But standing there now, seeing her error written in chalk, stripped of all professional hype, the truth became instantly clear to this ignored genius. She had included it simply because she assumed it was correct. It was not correct, and he could easily erase it. The clock read 1 minute and 8 seconds. This ignored worker picked up an eraser, wiping one single character off the 3rd line of her highly praised equation. Quietly, the chalk dust settled onto the tray, replacing it with his own modest handwriting, a sharp contrast to her flamboyant, confident loops. The elite crowd was confused at first, but the professor knew. Standing right behind him, she read the change over his shoulder, and the exact second his chalk finished writing that corrected symbol, the smug smile on her face suddenly froze with nowhere to go. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice stripped of confidence. It was the first genuine, unscripted moment from the famous academic all morning. Elias offered no reply. The ignored janitor simply stepped back, quietly studying his newly corrected equation. The false boundary he struggled with for 14 months had vanished. The true solution now flowed through his mind with absolute ease, like a truth that had finally been given permission to exist. He began to write, his hand moving with rapid, brilliant precision. His handwriting was tight, quiet, and deceptively simple. It was the script of a man dismissed as mere labor, practicing in secret solitude. He easily solved the formula that elite academic teams failed to crack. He rubbed out 2 symbols, replacing them with a brilliant form they never expected. No prestigious academic had ever even considered it. His solution was far simpler than their complex theories. It worked because he ignored her flawed assumptions. The first equation took him just 7 seconds. He slowed down next, making sure the shocked professors watching could actually follow his logic. The 3rd line flew up without any hesitation. With that final line, this overlooked man stepped far past the boundaries of what elite minds thought was possible. Up front, a shocked teaching assistant leaned in close to watch him. Having graded hundreds of papers over 2 years, she knew her stuff. She knew exactly what genius looked like on a blackboard. But what she was witnessing now was different. It was the most flawless, brilliant demonstration she had ever seen in person. No mistakes, no second guessing, just pure, unfiltered talent. Every single stroke of chalk had a purpose. Behind her, a seasoned professor slowly took off his glasses in utter disbelief. He had spent his early career trying and failing to solve this exact problem. He gave up after 8 months, trapped by the same rigid academic thinking. Now he stared at this untrained man, then turned to his colleague in shock. "He isn't using any of our textbook methods," Lansing whispered. "He is doing something entirely new." His colleague sat speechless. He couldn't tear his eyes away. Near the back, another scholar stood up, transfixed by this outsider's brilliance. He needed to stand just to process what he was seeing. Others noticed and began to stand up around him. Soon, a graduate student in the 4th row stood up too. Then 4 more stood right after her. With 48 seconds left, a third of the room was standing for this worker. Nobody dared to tell anyone to sit back down now. People pulled out their phones in disbelief. A student whispered her shock, and the sound carried forward through the stunned crowd. Nobody turned around to look, because everyone in front of her was already whispering the exact same thing in shock. Amelia stood frozen, watching this unassuming man completely rewrite the math over his shoulder. The arrogant smile had vanished from her face. As a world-class academic, she knew exactly what he was writing. She saw the truth with absolute clarity. Only the true creator of the theory could recognize that his work was flawless. And she knew exactly what this meant. If this outsider was right, her entire theory was wrong. The prestigious rule she had published 9 years ago and defended in 3 major papers was actually just a massive error. She had made a fundamental mistake. For nearly a decade, the entire field trusted her prestige, completely blind to the genius of the man now standing before them. Her entire career was built inside a narrow academic box. Every single research paper she published was confined to those limits. The Carter conjecture was her invisible medal, flaunted in the elitist way she carried herself into every room. But all her prestige relied on a constraint she had made up. Looking at his simple uniform, she felt a cold dread grip her stomach. Elias kept on writing. Online, the livestream quickly blew past 42,000 viewers. Elite graduate students watched in disbelief from their university offices. A retired German professor watched closely from his living room. Elias's former doctoral classmate was also tuning in. He watched from a cramped apartment in Cambridge, where he had spent the last 6 minutes staring in absolute silence. He had not seen the face of his brilliant peer in 9 years. Amelia stepped back, threatened by a man in a simple uniform. She gripped the wooden podium, desperate to reclaim her academic authority. The cameras captured her panic. She had to shut this outsider down. She felt her control slip as everyone stared at a man in dusty coveralls instead of her. You and I know that crowds always shift when the underdog is clearly more brilliant. She could not let him finish his proof, not on live television. Not while her prestigious name and life's work were on the line. She glanced over, focusing on the cheap name tag on his chest. Stitched onto his uniform was Elias Reed. That name triggered a distant memory. Not from Harvard, but from many years ago. She had heard that name 9 years prior, back when she was just a starting assistant professor and his advisor was hospitalized. After that, his graduate students quickly scattered. A formal memo went out announcing their program was closed. But one name from that list of dismissed students had lingered in her mind. She had completely forgotten it until now, but it clicked. She leaned into the microphone, waiting for the camera to capture her face. "Mr. Reed," she said. Her voice carried the cold confidence of an elite academic about to destroy a man's reputation. "That is your name, is it not, Elias Reed?" He did not turn around. The chalk kept moving. "Before you finish your little show," she said, "I think everyone here deserves to know exactly who you are." An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the crowd. It was definitely not laughter. Several people who had stood up in excitement quietly sat back down. Others remained standing, unsure whether to support the prestigious professor or the brilliant underdog. Mr. Reed was enrolled in a math PhD program 9 years ago, she announced. Amelia continued, her voice cold and steady. Measuring her words carefully, she added, he failed to finish. He dropped out before even taking his second-year exams. He has spent nearly a decade working basic maintenance jobs. He has no peer-reviewed publications whatsoever. He has not even stepped foot inside a mathematics conference in nearly 10 years. She faced the cameras, wearing a tight, dismissive little smile. I admire his spirit, she said, I really do. But we must be honest about what we are actually witnessing here. We are looking at a janitor, a college dropout, trying to solve this. Trying to solve a problem in 2 minutes that stumped 3 elite research teams for 9 years. This is not a comeback. It is just a man chasing a dream he abandoned a long time ago. The chalk froze. For the first time since Elias picked it up, he stopped. He stood frozen before the board. The timer showed 36 seconds left. The hand holding his chalk was no longer steady. The camera lenses stayed locked. In the back, the technician did not adjust a single camera angle. He had ignored Amelia's audio cues for 30 seconds, completely lost in the moment. He was mesmerized by the chalk. The harsh truth about his past was not actually a lie. He had dropped out. He never finished his work. His beloved advisor never came back from the hospital that May, and his apartment lease expired that same month. Soon his meager savings fell far below what any human could survive on. It was an impossible situation for a struggling grad student. On a quiet Wednesday morning, he walked into the office to withdraw. His paperwork was already completely filled out because he wanted nobody talking him out of it. He was only 29, but he felt 80 years old. He clearly remembered walking out of that office, the signed withdrawal form in his pocket. There was a student lounge just 2 doors down, but he walked right past without looking. He walked 7 blocks before realizing his eyes were completely dry. The crushing pain came much later. In fact, he still felt it. For 9 years, he hid in this building, pretending that the promising young academic in the photo inside his notebook no longer existed. He swept the hallways of his old academic field. For 9 years, he quietly accepted being treated like a nobody by everyone he passed. He had considered packing up and leaving Boston many times. But he avoided the real question, why was he staying? Was hiding in plain sight as a janitor just easier than facing the world again? Now, a total stranger had just exposed his secrets to 300 onlookers. Broadcasting lived to major math departments across 3 different countries, shaming him publicly for what he was most embarrassed of. A quiet, tired voice inside urged him to drop the chalk, to walk away and grab the broom he left against the wall, to return to being invisible, a role he had perfected for nearly a decade. He let that defeatist thought wash over him, then stared at the chalk in his grip. He stared at the complex math on the board, only 31 seconds left. Up in the front row, Hannah Pierce sat there holding her breath. She had stood up unconsciously, transfixed by his silent brilliance. She remained standing because she knew. Sitting down would mean agreeing with Amelia's shallow judgment of this man. She didn't really know the man standing at the board. They had only shared a brief greeting in an elevator during a snowy morning last February. That simple nod was the only connection they ever had. Yet she felt deep down that what he did next would shape the rest of his life. No matter how it turned out. He didn't look up, completely unaware of her presence in the room. He was battling a silent struggle deep inside. A personal mountain that nobody else in that room could see. It wasn't Amelia's words that cut the deepest. The real pain was that he had agreed with her for 9 years. He let them label him as just a janitor, and he accepted that small box. He allowed busy people to judge him by his uniform, ignoring him until he started ignoring his own brilliant mind too. For 9 long years he carried a notebook. Packed with brilliant ideas he assumed no academic would ever take seriously. Simply because he believed his humble job made his mind worthless to them. The ambitious young man in that old photo wasn't the failure. The real failure was hiding his talent all these years. He'd spent his private life solving a problem nobody asked him to. He didn't do it to impress Amelia. He didn't do it for Harvard either. He did it because the truth was worth chasing. With only 29 seconds remaining, He lifted his eyes and faced the blackboard again. He pressed the chalk against the board, right where he had paused. This wasn't about proving anything to Amelia anymore. He wasn't doing it for the rolling television cameras. He was doing it because the work deserved to be finished, a fact he'd forgotten for 9 years. As he wrote, the chalk glided with flawless precision. The elite crowd stared at his dusty coveralls in a breathless silence that spoke louder than words. The crucial formula took only 5 seconds to write down. He paused to review his progress, then confidently added the next equation below. Sitting near the back, Professor Daniel Whitman watched the second equation unfold. He felt that sudden, sharp realization that only a true academic understands. The moment when an impossible theory suddenly transforms from a fantasy into absolute, undeniable logic. He had personally reviewed every single published attempt to crack this legendary problem. He had even guided a brilliant researcher through 8 months of grueling calculations, only to watch that student give up in tears just last spring. Yet the line this janitor wrote broke completely free of those limits. A single mathematical symbol had unlocked a whole new path. 21 seconds left. Elias boldly wrote the very formula he had discovered alone a month ago. The exact line that kept him awake for 30 nights because of what it revealed. A massive flaw in Amelia's theory. But without her artificial limits, his logic was perfect. It cleared the path, and he followed it. The chalk clicked rhythmically against the slate, singing the song of a genius. Somewhere in the third row, a student holding a recording phone held her breath in sheer shock for 4 seconds. Exhaling slowly, completely blind to his uniform, Mark Lansing slowly turned his head toward the prestigious colleague sitting right beside him. He spoke without once taking his eyes off the chalkboard. "That is not a new technique," he whispered, barely loud enough to hear. "He is using the second team substitution. He's just not carrying her constraint through it." His colleague remained completely silent. The colleague had figured it out 4 seconds earlier, wondering if any certified mathematician in his entire career had ever done this. Pull off something so brilliant in real time. 14 seconds remain. Elias wrote the second-to-last line. He wrote slower than the others, not from doubt, but to ensure this unexpected proof was perfectly clear. This quiet genius had spent 14 months in a basement room solving this. And he wanted anyone who watched the footage later to easily follow his steps without needing an elite degree in mathematics. His humble handwriting was small and neat. It was the script of a self-taught outsider, writing carefully so his work would survive his own deepest doubts. 11 seconds left. The unassuming man pressed his chalk to the board for the final line. He did not hesitate once. He scribbled the final equation in one fluid motion, finishing with the signature mark he always used in his private notebooks. A simple horizontal line right under the last character. The exact way his old mentor taught him to claim a result he was fully prepared to defend. He placed the chalk gently back into the metal tray. Taking a step back from the chalkboard, he refused to turn and face the crowd. The countdown read 7 seconds, then 4, then stopped. The auditorium of elite scholars held its breath, completely stunned into silence by what this unlikely man had accomplished. Professor Daniel Whitman marched slowly down the side aisle. Without saying a single word, the department chair climbed the steps onto the stage. He walked right past Amelia without a glance, like someone ignoring a minor distraction to focus on the real miracle. He stopped at the board, scanning every single line from the top. With the practiced eyes of an academic teaching here for 30 years, he examined the corrected symbol on line 3. He studied the brilliant substitution. He read the exact line that had tortured Elias for 30 nights. He studied the second-to-last step, then the final expression. Let's pause here. He stood completely frozen for nearly 14 seconds, staring in sheer disbelief. He turned to the crowd and stated, "This is correct." His quiet voice carried effortlessly. A true genius does not need to shout. The microphone broadcast his words to global universities, where stunned professors watched the live feed of an unknown outsider, proving them all wrong. "I want to be completely clear about what I am saying. I am the chairman of this prestigious department. I have read every single published attempt to solve this. And the work on this chalkboard is absolutely correct. In my professional opinion, This unassuming man has just delivered the first complete proof of the Carter conjecture in history. The prestigious auditorium did not erupt in cheers. Instead, a profound, humbling silence washed over the room. The students who had been recording to mock this outsider slowly lowered their phones. They shared a look of pure awe, raising their devices to capture history instead. You and I can see they understood right away. They realized before the scholars did that this incredible underdog story had to be documented. In the 8th row, a graduate student silently began to cry. The physics department faculty member, who had been leaning back, stood up straight and walked slowly toward the front stage. Amelia stood completely frozen right next to her podium. Her years as an elite mathematician allowed her to understand the board the instant Elias finished writing his proof. She did not need Whitman to tell her the truth. She had known by the second to last line. In fact, you and I can see her career ending at the 3rd line, where this man in simple coveralls erased her character and wrote his own. She had watched her life's work collapse in real time over the last 120 seconds. Whitman's announcement was not news to her. It was just a public confirmation of a harsh truth. She had already accepted it with the quiet grace of a scholar who spent her life reading chalk on blackboards. Looking down, she stared at her hand gripping the podium. Her hand was steady, a calmness she had not expected to feel. All the cameras were on her. She had set them up herself just 2 days prior. Raising her eyes, she stared at the back of the man in work coveralls, who still had not turned around. He remained focused, staring at the board. He read his own writing, like a person reading a deeply personal letter they finally finished, but hesitate to send. She had promised the audience just 2 minutes ago that she would publicly apologize to anyone who solved this massive conjecture in 2 minutes, right in front of all Harvard. She had meant it as a joke. It was like putting an impossible price on something you believe will never be sold. You and I can probably feel the weight of the hard choice landing right before her. She could deny it all, or attack his quiet withdrawal even harder. She could face the cameras and demand formal peer review and proper procedures, claiming that a quick 2-minute chalkboard proof meant nothing until a scientific journal formally published it. That would buy her a week or two, but she refused to do that. She was suddenly weary of a hollow academic game she never realized tired her. Just last week, she told peers in the private faculty lounge that losing her unbeatable status was far worse. Back then, she was not even sure she meant it. Stepping away from her podium, she walked across the main stage. She stopped 4 feet from Elias, waiting for him to acknowledge her, which he did with slow, quiet dignity. It was how a man turns to someone he had noticed for 9 years but never spoken to. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. Speaking with a steady voice, she deliberately avoided the microphone because she refused to let this moment become some cheap public show. "I owe you several, actually. First, I apologize for what I said about your withdrawal. I weaponized your personal struggles to dismiss brilliant work I already knew was correct. I knew it was flawless, yet I attacked you anyway. It is the most shameful thing I have done here. And I did it right in front of 3 cameras. Staring at the board, she whispered, "The second apology is for the constraint. I introduced it 9 years ago, defended it in 3 subsequent papers, and I was wrong. For 9 years, the entire field worked inside a box I built. I do not know yet what that mistake actually costs. I will find out." With that, she turned to the auditorium. Every camera tracked her movement. "I promised this room a public apology and a recommendation letter." She said, "Mr. Reed has both. I will write that letter today. And this apology is the one I am giving right now." Walking back to the podium, she picked up her notes, folded them in half, and set them down. She never picked them back up. Her prepared speech for the next 35 minutes of the symposium was no longer what anyone wanted to hear. Across the river in Cambridge, inside a cramped apartment, a former colleague named Peter Vance sat frozen on the edge of his couch, staring at the livestream on his laptop. He had not budged for the last 6 minutes. Years ago, he and Elias had been brilliant doctoral classmates before their paths completely diverged. Peter had stayed in academia, while Elias had walked away. He grabbed his phone and began typing a message. He had no idea if the old number was still working. He sent it anyway. Back in the auditorium, Hannah Pierce sank into her seat because her legs were shaking. She watched the prestigious director step forward to shake the janitor's hand. She saw Elias quietly accept the gesture. It was how someone accepts respect when they have been ignored for far too long. He had a humble hesitancy in his shoulders that these arrogant scholars never showed. A subtle detail you would miss unless you were truly looking. Right then, she decided she would stop seeing just a uniform and actually learn his name. She would speak his name out loud the very next time she passed him working in the hallway. The symposium did not resume. After a hushed whisper with Amelia that the microphones failed to pick up, Whitman stepped forward. He announced to the stunned crowd that the morning session would end early. The entire recording would be sent directly to the department for review. And next week, a special committee would meet to formally verify this janitor's proof. He thanked the audience for their time. But he ignored Amelia completely. A cold snub that many in the room noticed but kept quiet about. Elias did not immediately run off the stage. He stood silently in front of the blackboard, admiring the work for a moment longer, before stepping back down the exact same side stairs he had climbed. His cleaning bucket still sat waiting by the back exit. The dirty mop was still propped against the wall, so he picked them both up. The crowd, the cameras, and the thousands watching online all watched him gather his cleaning gear and head for the exit. He went back to his utility cart, because to the school, those floors were still his duty. The hallways he swept at 5 a.m. were still his job to clean at 10 a.m. He did not retreat to the basement that afternoon. Instead, he quietly went to the second floor to finish his shift. His groundbreaking work remained unfinished before the prestigious symposium began. He silently emptied office trash cans while the scholars gossiped in the hallways. Everyone was watching the live stream replay on their phones. He mopped the long marble hallway outside the dean's suite, while 3 elite professors walked past him without a glance. Except this time, all 3 of them were staring. None of them knew what to say to a genius in a janitor uniform. He simply nodded at them, humble as he always was. That hallway felt both longer and shorter than usual, all at the exact same time. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a graduate student he had never met before knocked on the frame of the utility closet he was currently restocking. He was holding paper towels when she said the department head wanted to see him. He thanked her and quietly finished restocking the paper towels. He made his way up to the second floor. Daniel Whitman sat with his door open, standing up instantly the moment the janitor walked in. The distinguished professor remained standing for the first 3 minutes of their conversation. During those crucial minutes, he asked if the department could, with Elias's own permission, sponsor his return to the doctoral program, with full funding already quietly arranged. That the brilliant work he did that morning would be published only with his consent, listing him as lead author. Elias listened silently, refusing to give a quick yes or no right away. He simply replied that he would think about it. He mentioned he had already processed a lot of things while mopping the floors that morning, and pondering one more decision wouldn't be difficult. Whitman smiled warmly at that. It was the smile of a man hearing words he intended to remember. He shook the genius's hand once more before leaving. On his way out, he mentioned that a chalkboard in his own office had been wrong for 3 weeks, and he had heard rumors that the brilliant janitor had noticed. Elias looked at him for a quiet second and said yes, he had. Whitman nodded slowly, promising he would fix the equation that very night. He admitted he really should have caught the error himself. That evening, after the university had emptied, Elias quietly returned to the basement. He sat at his cheap folding table beneath a lamp bought across the river. He pulled out his worn yellow notepad, flipping it open to a blank page. For several quiet minutes, he did not write a single word. The old photograph, taped securely to the inside front cover, was still there. He looked at the image in a way he had not in 9 long years, viewing that young student as a relative he loved, rather than a failure he had become. He thought about the prestigious scholar in Cambridge whose text message had popped up on his phone earlier that afternoon, and about the invitation he had ignored all day, which he would finally reply to tonight. He also thought of the quiet woman in the front row whose name he didn't know, but whose face he had already filed away twice in his memories. Once during a brief elevator ride on a cold, snowy morning, and Once, during the final moments of a 2-minute countdown, when she stood up in her seat for a reason she couldn't explain. He wasn't sure if he would trade his uniform to join their elite ranks. He truly did not know. He didn't know how many top-tier universities would soon beg him to join them, or if he'd even bother responding. He had no idea that the famous Professor Amelia Carter would publicly retract 3 of her own celebrated research papers just 3 months later. Published under her name, that humble admission would become the most respected work of her career. In it, she wouldn't address him by some formal, distant title like Mr. Reed, but simply as Elias, and this time she truly meant it. All he knew, sitting under a dim lamp in the unauthorized basement room he had built for himself, was that he had wasted 9 long years working in a prestigious building that had happily dismissed him as an invisible custodian, simply because he let them do it. That morning 300 arrogant academics had laughed at his appearance, but he picked up the chalk anyway. And he had finished. He completed the proof because the math deserved to be solved, and halfway through the complex proof, as his rough hands moved across the blackboard, he had stopped, hiding behind a janitor's uniform, and finally became a genius working out in the open. He shut his notebook and clicked off the small desk lamp. Sitting quietly in the pitch-black cellar, he listened to the elite university bustling right above him. He still had no idea what his next move would be. But over the last 12 hours he realized he would never let a low-paying job or a humble room hide his brilliant mind again. Standing up, he quietly slid the cheap folding chair back under his desk. Then he walked up those dark stairs. He flicked off the hallway switch, leaving the building just like he had every single night for 9 years. But as the shadows rushed in for the first time, he did not feel like he was fading away with them.